government. Will new legislation really give the government the power to crack down on personal content? Well, that's what the opposition and many experts fear. After the federal government made a surprising change to the new broadcasting bill that's meant to regulate the web giants. Let me just give you some quick background. The legislation, it's called Bill C-10 if you care about that kind of thing, is intended to regulate big web giants like Netflix or Amazon Prime in the same way that Canadian media companies like Global, Bell Media, which owns this station, and CBC are regulated by the CRTC. But just over a week ago on a Friday afternoon, the government took out a clause in that bill that made an exemption for user-generated content. In other words, the stuff you and your family members or friends might upload to, say, Instagram or Spotify. Why did the government get rid of this key exemption? The government says this will only apply to professional content, this bill, not your personal social media stuff. Does this legislation actually pose a threat to freedom of speech? Why do the NDP support it? We're going to find out now. Joining me now are three MPs. Julie DeBruzen is the Heritage Parliamentary Secretary. Eric Duncan is a Conservative MP on this, and Heather McPherson is the NDP's Heritage critic. Good morning to all of you. Julie DeBruzen, let me just start with you. Why did the government get rid of what many regard as a legal safeguard that will ensure Canadians that user-generated content will never be regulated by the CRTC or the federal government?
And I'd like to start with that because, in fact, I want to be clear that earlier, as we were going through the bill, we actually confirmed a section that specifically protects and excludes users from being covered by the Broadcast Act. So what we're really talking about here is social media giants. We are not talking about individuals who are uploading posts to social media. But when we came to the part about should we create a blanket exemption that would mean that whenever a social media company might act as a broadcaster, that we would still exclude them. What we heard from particularly the music industry was that this would be creating a blanket exception that was too large, and that in the case where a social media company is in fact acting like a broadcaster, that they should be treated like all other broadcasters.
Right. So the concern, Mr. Duncan, is that, you know, in making this exception to the music industry, which are worried about streaming on things like Spotify, that now the floodgates are open, that the language is not precise enough and it can be applied to Twitter or Facebook. What's your legal concern here?
Well, there's a huge government overreach in this, Evan, and I think of all the issues in my limited time as a new MP, I've been hearing from tons of constituents and people across the country. We're seeing journalists, we're seeing professors that have a strong background in this. There's a ton of concern everywhere. To Julie's point, there's a blanket policy the other way of opening up and being so vague in general in this legislation that it could open the door, pass it over to the CRTC, the independent government body, and there's been a lot of challenges and frustrations over the year, but it's opening a huge can of worms. The government needs to focus on the big tech and those aspects, not on a teenager that's posting on TikTok or on Instagram. Huge overreach, and I think they're seeing, and they're certainly feeling the heat in the past couple of weeks as more Canadians are aware of this.
Ms. McPherson, I know the NDP's supporting this. Why would the NDP support something where the language seems imprecise enough to actually give the CRTC the possibility, as an unanticipated consequence, if they want to start regulating user-generated content? It seems from experts like Michael Geist who say clearly this gives them the power to do so.
Evan, I mean, to be clear, I think that it's really important that we keep this very, very realistic and very honest. There is an exclusion. There's an exclusion that says the teenager with the TikTok video is not going to be. This won't apply to them. The Broadcasting Act doesn't apply to them.
I just want to press on that. Section 4.1 of the Broadcasting Bill, which was widely seen as that exemption. I know there's other sections, but that was the explicit legal safeguard, and it was pulled. Why?
Because it didn't let any of those massive web giants that are acting as broadcasters, that are doing broadcasting undertakings. It didn't put any obligation on them. It didn't regulate those big guys at all. So, you know, we're hearing all this rhetoric about this being an attack on individuals. This is actually to make sure that the web giants are being held to account, that they have to be held as the same way that our Canadian broadcasting are. If they're broadcasting, they should be applicable under the Broadcasting Act.
Well, let me go back to Ms. DeBruzen, because when you took out that section on a Friday afternoon, a lot of folks called me and they, you know, experts, and said this is really dangerous, because now the fear is that in trying to regulate the web giants, for example, the CRTC could, given this new interpretation, interpret tweets as a program. In other words, the language is too loose.
I can't underline enough what Ms. McPherson just referred to, which is there is a specific exclusion that's built right into the Act and has already been approved, and it's in there, saying that individuals who are posting to social media are not covered. And I believe that just at the beginning, you mentioned the same thing. Broadcasters like the one that carried this show are covered by the Broadcasting Act. The Broadcasting Act is broad. It does not cover content moderation. It's about the framework for how these work and the contributions they make to Canadian content. What I don't understand is why the Conservatives feel like we should be creating such a broad exception for social media companies that they don't have to pay towards Canadian content.
Mr. Duncan.
Well, we're not saying that at all. And what we're saying is the focus needs to be on that, is making sure the web giants and those large companies are modernized and held accountable. But we're seeing through these, I believe, blanket amendments we're seeing on it. Evan, just to give you an idea, one of the things that Conservatives are calling for, including at the committee that's reviewing the bill, is every piece of legislation has to get a charter statement to make sure it's compliant with the charter. We're asking now, based on the amendments we've seen, the ones you're alluding to in the last couple of weeks, is we want to do a new charter statement on these things to check about freedom of expression, check on freedom of speech, and we haven't been able to get that yet. So I'm very anxious to see some of those wordings on there. You guys did just
filibuster the entire committee. So you know, in terms of us actually getting a modern broadcasting act for Canadian broadcasters, the best way to do that is that we all work together, that we're all working to build a better bill.
Julie DeBruzen, Eric Duncan, and Heather McPherson, I really appreciate you outlining this. I know the process isn't completed, but Canadians need to know this stuff. Thank you so much.